Denali National Park is not just a nature reserve with scenic views. It is an ancient, breathing entity whose lungs are endless coniferous forests and whose heart is mountain peaks covered in eternal snow, beating to a rhythm inaccessible to human hearing. Here time flowed differently, obeying not the leisurely march of clocks, but the age-old cycles of birth and decay. The laws here were written not by man, but by nature itself, and they were carved not in official codes, but in instincts, in the memory of ancestors, in the patterns of frost on stones, and in the depths of bears' eyes. Anna was not just a ranger. She was part of this ancient organism, its blood and nerve endings. She had spent her entire conscious life in Denali, with more than a dozen hiking seasons behind her. She knew every stream whose babble could point the way to camp, every bear trail worn through the thick grass, every creaky cedar under whose shade one could shelter from a sudden storm. She taught tourists the simple, clear rules, written in the blood of those who had broken them. Don't leave food, it will attract a bear. Don't leave the trail, the tundra does not forgive mistakes. Don't look a wolf or a grizzly in the eye, it's a challenge they will answer. But there was one more law, an ancient one, passed on in a whisper, not included in any official booklet or mentioned on any instructional sign. She had heard it from an old native guide named Joseph, whose face was like the dried-up bed of a mountain river, etched with wrinkled streams. One evening by the campfire, watching the dancing flames reflected in his dark, bottomless eyes, he said to her in a voice that creaked with ancient ice, "Remember, girl, the most important law of the tundra, the one older than all these mountains. Never pick up what lies on the ground if it is perfectly whole. Nature creates nothing perfect here. A broken branch, a gnawed bone, a stone with a chip, that's normal. That's life. But anything that is whole and untouched by time, the elements or beast, that is not a gift. It's a trap. It is not lost. It is waiting for its hour." Anna had nodded then, treating it as a local superstition, a colorful but empty campfire tale meant to keep the overly curious visitors in check. The law about food and bears seemed far more real and tangible to her. She smiled, thanked the old man, and forgot about this warning as one forgets a dream by noon. And so, on one of those late autumn days when the sun was liquid and cold, like molten tin on a leaden sky, and the air rang with the anticipation of the first real blizzard, Anna was patrolling a remote, almost forgotten section of the park, the Valley of Silent Winds. A tourist's foot rarely stepped there, and even the rangers themselves showed up no more than once a season. The place had a bad reputation. People disappeared here, and those who returned spoke of an inexplicable melancholy that washed over them amidst the perfectly beautiful landscape. Her dog, a faithful white husky named Barry, usually tireless and cheerful, was behaving strangely today. She wasn't running ahead, but behind, her head hung low, and only occasionally, reluctantly, sniffed at tracks. Suddenly Barry froze, rooted to the spot. All her muscles tensed, the fur on her scruff stood on end, baring her teeth, and a low, vibrating growl, full of such primal hatred and fear that Anna had never heard anything like it from her pet, erupted from her throat. The dog stared at a single point in the middle of an absolutely flat, untouched snowfield whose whiteness hurt the eyes. Anna followed her gaze, squinting in the bright light, and her heart skipped a beat for a moment. In the middle of this snowy silence, where by all laws of geology and logic there should have been nothing but snowdrifts, lay a stone. It was small, the size of her fist, but its presence felt enormous, overwhelming. It was perfect. Absolutely smooth, polished to a mirror-like, almost metallic shine, without a single crack, scratch, or dent. A deep raven-black color that seemed not just to absorb sunlight but to draw it in, creating a slight shimmering haze that distorted the air around it. It lay on the snowy blanket like an alien artifact or a jewel forgotten by a giant. Joseph's law echoed in her head like a loud alarm bell. Never pick up. But curiosity, that very flaw that had doomed more than one person, had already sunk its hooks into her brain. Rationality, drilled into her by years of work, immediately spoke up. It's just a stone, an unusual basalt, polished by a glacier, a unique geological specimen, a beautiful souvenir. Quiet, Barry, calm down, she said. But the dog didn't relent, continuing to growl, backing away and leaving grooves in the snow with her claws. Anna took a step forward, then another. The frosty air suddenly seemed thick as syrup to her. She bent down, reached out her thickly gloved hand and picked it up. The stone was surprisingly, unnaturally heavy, as if she had lifted not a small rock, but an entire granite boulder. And the cold. It was icy, much colder than the surrounding air. This cold didn't just nip at the skin, it penetrated through the glove, through the flesh, right into the bone, carrying with it a strange, viscous sensation of emptiness. Barry howled, long, mournful, almost human-like, turned around and fled into the forest without looking back. "Barry, stop!" Anna shouted, but the dog didn't obey. For the first time in all the years, with an uneasy feeling in her soul, but still not releasing the stone from her hand, Anna trudged back to her cabin. On the way, it seemed to her that the trees on either side of the trail leaned lower, as if recoiling from her and her burden. The wind, usually vocal in these parts, died down, and an oppressive dead silence fell. In her cozy cabin, smelling of smoke, pine needles and leather, she placed the stone on the massive wooden table that served as both her desk and dining table. She lit the fireplace, but the familiar heat couldn't seem to drive away the penetrating cold emanating from the stone. And then, while making dinner, she felt it for the first time, an alien gaze, sharp, intent, mercilessly analytical, devoid of any warmth or curiosity. The gaze of a predator studying its prey. She spun around sharply, her heart pounding in her chest, expecting to see the face of a bear or a lynx in the single window. But outside the glass, only the thick, impenetrable, living darkness of the Alaskan night was gathering. The gaze didn't come from outside. It came from inside the room, directly from the table. She walked over and stared at the stone. It lay motionless, black and silent, but it seemed to her that it wasn't just lying on the table. It was occupying the table, taking its place, and now it was watching. A mute, perfect pupil, absorbing not light, but the very atmosphere of the home, its warmth, its history. The night passed restlessly. Anna had strange dreams. She was wandering across an endless snowy plain, and black, perfectly round stones were falling from the sky, and each one, landing beside her, swallowed a piece of her memory. She woke up with a heavy head and a feeling of inexplicable loss. The morning began with a nightmare more terrifying than any dream. She called Barry for breakfast. The dog approached reluctantly, wagging its tail but with its head down and not looking her in the eye. Anna opened her mouth to say her name and felt icy horror. There was emptiness in her head, a clean, bleached sheet. She looked at the faithful dog, at its intelligent, now sorrowful eyes, at the familiar white fur, and couldn't remember its name. A lump rose in her throat, choking her. She frantically went through the names she had given dogs over the years. Buddy, Loki, Rex, Sam. None resonated in her memory, none suited this creature. In panic, she grabbed the collar. The tag was engraved with Barry. The relief was brief and immediately replaced by a chilling, all-consuming terror. She had forgotten her dog's name. The dog that had been with her for 7 years, slept at her feet, shared all the hardships and joys with her. That was only the beginning. The beginning of the end. The stone stood on the table, silent and heavy, and its cold was now felt throughout the cabin despite the stove being red hot. And Anna was becoming lighter. First, the names left her, colleagues, friends from the nearest settlement, her boss. She picked up the radio to make contact and couldn't remember the call signs. Then the faces began to fade. She found a photograph of her mother on a shelf, taken at her graduation. She looked at the smiling young woman with her own eyes, and the features of her face blurred, melted away like patterns on fogged glass. She remembered the abstract concept of mom, but couldn't recall what she exactly looked like, what her voice sounded like, how her perfume smelled. Memories began to disappear like puddles on hot asphalt. Her first hike, her first love, her first kiss. All of it turned into faded, silent pictures, devoid of emotions and smells, and then crumbled into dust altogether. She tried to write down the most important things in a notebook, but rereading the lines, she couldn't remember the context, the sensations behind the words. They were just ink on paper. She finally connected it to the stone. Too many coincidences. Every time she passed the table, a cold shiver ran through her to the bone, and a white haze flashed in her head, taking with it another fragment of the past. She tried to throw it away. Once, gathering all her willpower, she took the stone to carry it far into the forest. But she couldn't. Not physically, it seemed to have grown attached to her hand, and such a whirlwind of panic and pain rose in her head that she, sobbing, returned it to the table. The stone was not just an object. It was a parasite that had burrowed into her life. Now it didn't just lie, it owned the cabin. The wood of the table beneath it had darkened and become covered with frost. The air around it was icy and thick. Anna began to notice something new. Sometimes, out of the corner of her eye, it seemed that the stone was not perfectly round, but had a protrusion resembling a head, or a depression resembling a mouth. The illusion lasted for a fraction of a second, but it chilled her to the bone. One night she woke up with a feeling of absolute, all-consuming emptiness. She lay in bed and couldn't remember who she was. Her name, her profession, her age, her past, everything was washed away like drawings in the sand by a mighty tide. In her head, there was only a white, silent, endless whirlwind. The only reality, the only anchor in this advancing nothingness was the crushing, all-pervading cold emanating from the table, the cold from the black, perfect, insatiable stone. She got up and walked over to it, moving like a sleepwalker, her body light, almost weightless. She reached out her hand to touch it and realized that this was the only thing she now remembered. Its cold, its weight, its perfect soulless form. She had forgotten what love was, fear, joy. She had forgotten what it meant to be human. Anna was becoming lighter every day. She barely ate, barely slept, turning into a transparent shadow. Her memories, her personality, herself, all of it was being absorbed by the stone, becoming part of its mute, cold, eternal mass. She was like a snowflake, beautiful, intricate, but ready to melt at the slightest breath and disappear without a trace, leaving neither memory nor regret. She no longer tried to fight. She sat in her chair, looking out the window at the majestic, snow-covered peaks of Denali, which she had once loved so madly, and didn't remember their names, didn't feel the former awe. Barry, her faithful dog, had long since run away into the forest, unable to bear what his mistress had become, and the smell of deathly cold that had replaced the familiar scent of home. The last coherent memory, which slowly slid from her consciousness like the last drop of water from an overturned bowl, was the face of old Joseph, illuminated by the campfire, and his words, which had now become prophetic. It is not lost. It is waiting for its hour. Now, in the cabin, in the chair by the extinguished fireplace, sat an empty shell, light, almost weightless, breathing so rarely and quietly that the movement of her chest was almost imperceptible. Her eyes were open, but there was no thought, no awareness in them, only the reflection of the window frame and the white light outside. And on the table lay the stone, It was still perfectly smooth, glossy, and black. But if someone with sharp eyesight and strong nerves were to look at it very carefully, they might think that in its depths, in the very heart of the blackness, a shadow flickered for a moment, a vague but recognizable image, the reflection of a smiling woman's face, Anna's face, as it was before that fateful day in the Valley of Silent Winds. A face that it had once taken, absorbed, and now kept in its cold, stony, eternal memory. It had waited, and it had succeeded, and now it was ready to wait again until the next victim broke the ancient law of the tundra.